Truth doesn't die in silence. Not here. This is Tales of Black.
All right, welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really plunge into the facts behind the headlines. We dissect popular claims with, let's say, a scalpel of historical evidence and, well, a good dose of genuine curiosity.
That's the plan.
Today, we're tackling a narrative that's really taken social media by storm. It sparked some pretty passionate debates across countless platforms. It's the idea that Black Moors ruled Europe and were later whitewashed. Now, that's a really compelling assertion, right?
Yeah.
Often presented as this kind of hidden truth.
It really is, and it resonates deeply, especially in our current discussions about history, race, identity.
Exactly. But is it? Well, is it accurate? Can we actually verify this claim through the lens of history?
And that's precisely our mission today. Like, this isn't about taking sides or, endorsing any particular viewpoint. Not at all.
Right.
Our approach is purely one of, let's call it, rigorous historical verification. We're going to unpack the historical realities, deconstruct the very terms used in this claim.
The words themselves, yeah.
Exactly. And meticulously examine how the actual facts line up with or, diverge from this popular and very specific narrative. Think of us as, historical detectives, sifting through the clues to piece together the truth.
Love that. And to crack this historical case, we're definitely not relying on just one type of evidence. Oh, no.
Definitely not.
We are pulling from a really rich, intricate tapestry of sources today. We're talking ancient chronicles, giving us direct accounts, though sometimes biased, from the periods in question.
Right, this contemporary views.
We'll consult modern archaeological findings, which can reveal the physical realities, the stuff left behind. We'll scrutinize detailed art analysis, how people were actually depicted at the time. That offers a visual counterpoint, doesn't it?
A really important one, yes. Seeing versus just reading.
Then we'll delve into literary critiques, unpacking the language, the symbolism in historical texts. And maybe most fascinatingly, we'll even bring in cutting-edge genetic studies.
Yeah, the DNA evidence is powerful.
It tells us about population movements, ancestry, with remarkable precision. So this is truly a multi-layered, evidence-based approach. We want to get as close to the truth as possible.
And that comprehensive approach is absolutely crucial because, as you'll quickly discover, a core part of the confusion lies right there, in the words themselves. The terms Moor and Black, they haven't stayed static over centuries. Their meanings have shifted really dramatically sometimes, absorbing new connotations over time.
So applying our modern ideas back then.
Exactly. Applying our modern, often anachronistic concepts back into historical periods can deeply obscure the truth. We need to be super precise about what those words meant in the specific historical contexts we're examining, rather than just slapping our current understandings onto the past.
Got it. So this isn't just some dry history lesson then. It's actually a vital exercise in critical thinking. It equips you, the listener, with tools to navigate this world that's just overflowing with information and, let's face it, misinformation.
A useful skill these days.
For anyone who wants to be truly well-informed, without feeling totally swamped, this is exactly what we do. We cut through the noise, bring you the surprising facts, maybe connect some dots.
Let's do it.
Let's unravel this historical mystery, starting with that really enigmatic term, the Moor. Okay, let's start right at the beginning with the Moor. What exactly did that term signify? Where did it come from? Because as you pointed out, this seems to be where a lot of the modern misconception really kicks off.
You've absolutely hit on a foundational point. The term Moor. Well, it has deep classical roots stretching all the way back to ancient Rome.
Okay.
It originated from the Latin word morus. Now, the ancient Romans used it quite specifically, geographically. It referred to the inhabitants of a particular region, the kingdom, and later the Roman province of Mauritania.
Mauritania, so that's like modern-day Morocco, parts of Algeria.
Roughly, yes. Western North Africa. So initially, it was purely an ethnogeographic label. It defined the indigenous Berber peoples of that Maghreb region. The Greeks had their equivalent term, Marouzios. But crucially, at this initial stage, Moors had no specific religious or racial connotation beyond, what was characteristic of those North African populations. It was simply a descriptor of where people were from, like saying Britain or Gaul.
So not a race, not a religion, just a place.
Yeah.
That's a massive distinction right off the bat, especially given how the term gets thrown around today.
Huge.
But how did that initial geographically precise term morph into what we tend to think of as Moor in, say, medieval Christian Europe?
Ah, that's where the evolution gets really interesting and frankly a bit messy. As the Muslim conquests swept across North Africa in the 7th and early 8th centuries,
Right.
and then crossed into the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD, Christian Europeans adapted this classical Roman term. Latin's Morus evolved through the various Romance languages. It became Moor in Old French, Moor in Spanish and Portuguese, Moor or Moor in Middle English.
Okay, so the word itself traveled and changed.
Exactly. And this linguistic journey isn't just some academic footnote. It clearly shows the term's persistent use to describe these new Muslim powers they were encountering to their south. It became associated with the conquerors.
So it turned into a kind of linguistic shorthand, a way to, I guess, lump different groups together.
Precisely. Moor transformed into an overarching exonym, a name given by outsiders for the Muslim inhabitants of Iberia, Sicily, and North Africa.
Right, an us versus them kind of label.
In many ways, yes. It conveniently grouped distinct peoples, primarily Arabs and Berbers, under one umbrella term, often for convenience, maybe, or to create a simplified image of the other or the enemy.
Okay.
However, its meaning remained incredibly fluid and often quite imprecise, depending heavily on the context and who was speaking. For instance, in Spain and Portugal, there were times when Christian chroniclers might try to distinguish between, say, lighter-skinned Berber Moors and other groups. But then you look at Italy, and Moor was often used almost interchangeably with Saracen, which was just a generic catch-all term for any Muslim, regardless of their origin, Arab, Berber, Persian, whatever. So it was never a precise ethnic or racial label that aligns with our modern definitions, not even close.
And this fluidity, this imprecision, that seems to be the absolute heart of the modern confusion we're seeing.
Absolutely.
So when did the term Moor start picking up those racial overtones, moving beyond just geography or religion and into something that looks more like our modern understanding of black?
That shift is critical. Absolutely critical to understanding the misconception we're tackling today, particularly in English usage, starting around the 14th century, maybe a bit later too.
Okay, so well into the medieval period.
Yes. The term Moor began to acquire increasingly racial overtones. It slowly morphed into a more general designation for dark-skinned or black people, sometimes irrespective of their actual origin or their faith.
Ah, so that's where Blackamoor comes in.
Exactly. This is where you start seeing terms like Blackamoor or Moro Negro in Spanish being used quite explicitly to denote a person of very dark complexion, often, but not always, implying sub-Saharan African descent.
Right.
This evolution is the absolute core misconception we're addressing. The meaning shifted. It went from a specific ethnogeographic label for people from Mauritania, Maori, to a broad religious and geographic label for Muslims in Iberia and North Africa, Moro, and then finally, much later, to a racial descriptor, Moor, as in Blackamoor, implying a dark-skinned or black person.
Okay.
So when someone today asks if Black Moors ruled Europe, they're applying this later racialized definition.
Back onto a time when it didn't mean that.
Precisely. It simply didn't exist in the same way or carry the same weight during the early centuries of Muslim rule in Iberia. Historical sources were using those earlier, more complex ethnogeographic and religious definitions. This mismatch, this anachronistic application of modern racial categories, it's the fundamental source of the historical confusion.
It's like trying to ask if medieval knights wore sneakers, like you said. The concept just doesn't fit the time period. 15-second pause. That distinction is incredibly important. Wow. It really shows how profoundly the language we use and how it changes can obscure historical realities. So, with that crucial context in mind, let's move past the labels for a moment and dive into the actual human element. Who were these people, the actual conquerors who arrived in the Iberian Peninsula in 711 AD, and what kind of, multi-ethnic society did they forge in Al-Andalus, that part of the peninsula under Muslim rule?
Right. So the initial invading force in 711 AD, it was indeed a mixed army sent from North Africa under the banner of the powerful Umayyad Empire, which was centered way over in Damascus at the time.
Okay.
But here's the crucial detail that often gets, glossed over. This army was predominantly composed of recently converted indigenous North Africans, the people known as the Berbers, or by their own name, the Imazian.
Predominantly. So, how many?
Well, historical sources and modern analyses consistently suggest they made up the vast majority of the soldiers, perhaps as much as 65–70%, maybe even more, of that initial invading force.
Oh, okay.
And their famed commander, Tariq ibn Ziyad, the one who led the initial crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar, whose name, Jabal Tariq, Tariq's Mountain gives us Gibraltar.
Right.
He was himself a Berber.
So it wasn't a purely Arab invasion, which is often the simplified story you hear. The Berbers were truly the military backbone of this whole monumental undertaking.
Exactly. While the leadership, the top brass, and the elite corps were Arabs sent by the Umayyad governor, Musa ibn Nusayr, the Arab element, was actually a distinct minority within that invading force, and also in the subsequent early settlements in Iberia. This initial composition, with its really strong Berber contingent, profoundly shaped the society that emerged, the society we call Al-Andalus.
Okay. And what kind of society did emerge from this conquest? Was it, some harmonious melting pot of cultures and peoples? Or was it something far more structured and maybe tense?
Oh, far from a melting pot in the way we think of it today. Al-Andalus was a deeply multi-ethnic society, yes, but also quite rigidly hierarchical.
Hierarchical, okay. How so?
Well, at the very top of this complex social ladder, especially in the early centuries, you typically found the Arab elite. These individuals often came from established Syrian and Yemeni tribes. They held significant political, cultural, and religious power.
Right.
And they tended to view themselves as superior, often looked down upon non-Arab Muslims, even those Berbers who had fought alongside them in the conquest. They were the ones establishing the foundational institutions of the new Islamic State.
And the Berbers then? Despite their crucial military role, they found themselves in a sort of secondary position within this hierarchy.
Precisely. Despite being the indispensable military backbone of the conquest and forming a very large part of the population, Berbers were often relegated to secondary status.
How did that play out?
Well, they were frequently settled in less desirable lands within Al-Andalus, harsher regions, more mountainous areas, which, as you can imagine, often led to feelings of resentment and injustice.
Yeah, I can see that causing friction.
It absolutely did. This dynamic fueled significant tensions and numerous revolts against the Arab aristocracy throughout the long history of Al-Andalus. Especially in the early centuries, these weren't just minor skirmishes, they were substantial challenges to the established order. There was real conflict there.
So, significant internal strife and hierarchy, even among the Muslim population itself. That's interesting. But what about the native Iberian population, the people who were already living there before 7/11? How did they fit into this new social fabric?
This is a truly key insight and one that often gets completely overlooked in those simplified narratives. The single largest group in Al-Andalus, by the 11th century anyway, were the Muladis, or Muwaladun in Arabic.
Muladis, who were they?
These were the descendants of the native Visigothic and Hispano-Roman populations who had converted to Islam over time.
The local converts.
Exactly. And by around the year 1100, they comprise a staggering proportion. Estimates suggest up to 80% of the Muslim population of Al-Andalus.
80%? That's huge.
It is. This is a vital point. The overwhelming majority of the Muslim population of Al-Andalus was actually of native Iberian origin, not immigrants from North Africa or the Middle East. They adopted Islam, they adopted Arabic as a lingua franca, but they maintained many aspects of their original Iberian culture.
Wow. Okay, any other significant groups in this mix?
Yes, you also had the Saqaliba, a really fascinating group. These were European slaves, often of Slavic origin, hence the name. They were typically castrated and served in the courts and armies.
Slaves, but could they gain influence?
Surprisingly, yes. Despite their origins, they could rise to incredibly high military and administrative positions within the system. Some even governed cities or led armies. Their rise was often due to their loyalty being directly to the ruler, as they had no local tribal affiliations to complicate things. They were seen as trustworthy servants by the caliphs.
Fascinating how these different groups navigated such complex social strata. Now, okay, back to the original claim. It talks specifically about black Moors. We've established the term Moor itself is fluid, but were there sub-Saharan Africans present in Al-Andalus? And if so, what was their role, and maybe crucially, their demographic significance?
Yes, okay. Sub-Saharan Africans were indeed present in Al-Andalus. Our sources absolutely acknowledge them as a component of that diverse group labeled Moor.
Where did they come from primarily?
They arrived primarily from regions south of the Sahara, places like modern-day Mauritania, Senegal, Mali. They came via the long-established trans-Saharan trade routes.
The trade caravans.
Exactly. This trade network, which spanned centuries, wasn't just about gold and salt. It was also a significant pipeline for enslaved people, supplying labor for both North Africa and Al-Andalus.
What kind of roles did they have?
Well, male slaves typically worked as laborers in agriculture, maybe mining, or as domestic servants, or they were conscripted as soldiers. Female slaves were often domestic servants or became concubines within wealthy households.
I imagine they would have been a visibly distinct part of the population,
Yeah.
especially in certain contexts.
They certainly were, particularly in specific roles. They featured prominently as soldiers, for example, especially in the armies of the later Almoravid and Almohad empires.
The Berber empires you mentioned earlier?
Yes. Those dynasties originated in North Africa but had expanded deep into West Africa, and they recruited heavily from those regions. So their armies often included significant numbers of black soldiers.
And the chronicles mention this.
Oh, yes. Chronicles of the time describe these soldiers with distinctly dark skin. For instance, that 13th century Christian chronicle, the Historia de España, a major historical work, vividly noted soldiers whose faces were black as pitch and described others who were as black as a cooking pot.
Wow, that's quite graphic.
It is, and this is also where that term Blackamoor, or Moro Negro in Spanish, sometimes explicitly appeared in Christian texts, specifically to distinguish these individuals with very dark complexions from the lighter-skinned, maybe tawny, Berber and Arab Moor.
Okay, so they were there, they were recognized as distinct.
But, and this is the absolutely crucial caveat, it cannot be overstated sub-Saharan Africans, while present and culturally significant in certain roles, they never formed the ruling class, nor did they constitute a majority or even a substantial minority of the general population in Al-Andalus.
So a component, but not the defining one, and certainly not the rulers.
Precisely. They were a significant but minority component of a much larger, incredibly diverse society. And they were largely concentrated in specific urban centers or within military units, not spread evenly throughout the population.
Okay.
15-second pause.
That's a really vital distinction, clarifying the actual demographic landscape. Now, you mentioned modern analysis earlier. How do these historical accounts, based on chronicles and social structures, how do they stack up against more recent scientific tools like genetic history? Can DNA analysis actually shed even more light on the demographics of Al-Andalus? Can it confirm or maybe refute these historical narratives?
Absolutely. Modern genetic studies offer a truly powerful and, importantly, independent tool to verify these historical population dynamics. It's like peeling back layers of centuries of history.
How does that work?
Well, autosomal DNA analysis, looking at the bulk of our genetic inheritance of contemporary Spanish and Portuguese populations, for example, reveals a distinct North African genetic footprint.
Still there today.
Oh, yes. This footprint is significantly higher in Iberia than in other European populations. It serves as a direct and, frankly, undeniable genetic legacy of the Al-Andalus period. The history is literally written in the genes.
So the influence is still detectable in the modern gene pool. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Is it a huge percentage?
Well, the genetic admixture from North Africa is estimated to be around 4 to 12% on average in the general Iberian population today.
Okay, 4 to 12%.
With higher concentrations observed, as you might expect, in the south and west of the Iberian Peninsula, the regions that were under Muslim rule for the longest periods.
Makes sense.
Now, here's where it gets really fascinating and directly supports our earlier historical discussion about Berbers versus Arabs. When geneticists examine Y chromosome haplogroups.
Those are the markers passed down just through the male line, right?
Exactly, like unique ancestral stamps. They find something very telling. The main Y chromosome haplogroup associated with this North African admixture is EM81.
EM81.
Which is widely considered the Berber marker. And this marker is much more prevalent in modern Iberians than the Arab J1 haplogroup, which is associated with populations from the Arabian Peninsula.
Ah. So more Berber DNA than Arab DNA from that period.
Significantly more, yes. This genetic evidence strongly supports the historical accounts we just discussed, a relatively small Arab elite, but a much larger Berber migration and presence that form the demographic backbone of the Muslim presence in Iberia.
That's incredible. It really provides a scientific validation, doesn't it, for what the historical records have been hinting at all along.
It does.
But what about the specific claim of black rule? Does genetics speak to that, given the Blackamoor's assertion we started with?
It does, and quite definitively. It acts as a powerful refutation, actually. Sub-Saharan African ancestry in modern Iberians is found to be less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
Yes. To put that in perspective, that's an insignificant amount when you're considering a population that might have formed a ruling class or a significant demographic component. It's trace ancestry, basically.
So the genetics strongly argue against that narrative.
Very strongly. This genetic evidence refutes the notion that a black people, in the sub-Saharan African sense, ruled or formed a significant demographic component of Iberia. Furthermore, studies of ancient skeletal remains from the actual Islamic period.
From archaeological sites.
Exactly. They show a Berberized population, meaning significant North African ancestry, which persisted right up until the 17th century. But then, this genetic bridge between Iberia and North Africa sharply declined after the tragic expulsion of the Moriscos between 1609 and 1614.
Which was that devastating act of ethnic cleansing, effectively severing that long-standing genetic connection you mentioned.
Indeed, a brutal end to that chapter. And interestingly, many Moriscos who managed to escape or were exiled, particularly to the Americas, actually carried this North African ancestry with them, which helps explain its presence, sometimes unexpectedly, in some Latin American populations today.
Wow, the echoes reach far.
They really do. So, to reiterate, based on both centuries of historical accounts and cutting-edge genetic science, Al-Andalus wasn't a homogeneous entity or some simple melting pot. It was a clearly hierarchical society with distinct ethnic components.
Right.
Calling the rulers or the people black is a massive oversimplification. It overlooks the main ethnic components: Arabs, Berbers, and most numerically significant, those native Iberians who had converted to Islam. The term Moor, as we discuss, actually obscured this complexity by lumping them all together under one convenient external label.
So Moorish rule wasn't one consistent thing either. It must have changed hands, and the ethnic composition of the rulers probably shifted over those nearly 800 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you walk us through the chronology? Who was actually in charge and when? This seems crucial to dismantling the idea of a single monolithic Moorish ruler.
Certainly. And you're right. The nearly 800 years of Muslim rule in Al-Andalus saw several distinct ruling dynasties and also significant periods of fragmentation. It was far from static.
Okay, where do we start?
First, we have the era of the Umayyad Emirate and later the Caliphate of Cordoba. This lasted roughly from 756 to 1031.
The Umayyads. They were Arab, right?
Yes. This was established by Abd al-Rahman I, an Umayyad prince with clear Arab origins. He famously fled the Abbasid Revolution in Damascus, embarked on this perilous journey across North Africa, and eventually carved out his own kingdom in Iberia.
Like the story.
It really is. They made Cordoba their capital, transforming it into one of the world's most advanced and, frankly, dazzling centers of learning, science, and culture. A true jewel of the medieval world.
So this was the golden age, you could say,
Yeah.
and largely Arab-led.
Exactly. This period marked the political and cultural zenith of a unified Arab-led Al-Andalus. Al-Rahman III even took the step of proclaiming himself caliph in 929.
What did that signify?
It asserted full political and religious independence from the larger Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. It was also a bold challenge to the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa. It was a clear statement. We are a powerful, independent Arab Muslim state right here in the West.
Okay. What happened after that unified Arab rule? Did it just fade away or collapse?
It eventually collapsed, yeah. Around 1031, the Caliphate of Cordoba disintegrated due to internal strife, succession disputes, widespread rebellions, the usual suspects for imperial decline.
Right.
This led to a period of intense fragmentation known as the Taifa kingdoms. This lasted through much of the 11th and mid-12th centuries. Al-Andalus splintered into many independent mini-states called taifas, each vying for power.
So who ruled these Taifa kingdoms?
Still Arabs. It was much more mixed. The rulers came from the diverse ethnic groups of the Andalusi elite. You had Arab dynasties, yes, but also Berber dynasties, and even some former Saqaliba slaves managed to establish their own short-lived kingdoms.
Really? Slaves becoming rulers?
In some cases, yes, briefly. You had examples like the Berber Aftisid dynasty in Badajoz and the Zirids in Granada. Then you contrasted that with the powerful Arab Abbasid dynasty in Seville, who cultivated this renowned court of poets and scholars. So this period clearly shows a significant shift away from unified Arab rule towards a far more fragmented, multi-ethnic governance.
Power was distributed among different groups within the Muslim population.
Exactly, and often locked in bitter rivalries with each other, which, unfortunately for them, significantly weakened them against the advancing Christian kingdoms to the north. 15-second pause.
So, okay, we've moved from a unified, largely Arab-dominated rule in Cordoba to this fragmented landscape with diverse rulers, Arabs, Berbers, even Saqaliba, heading up these Taifa states. What came next in this complex chronology of power in Al-Andalus?
Right. Next came the period of the great Berber empires from North Africa. First the Almoravids, and then the Almohads who replaced them. This era roughly spanned from about 1086 to 1238.
So outside powers coming in.
Essentially, yes. The Taifa kings, remember, were weakened by their constant infighting and also the increasing pressure from the Christian kingdoms involved in the Reconquista. They found themselves desperate for aid.
So they called for help.
Reluctantly, yes. They sought assistance from the Almoravids. Now, the Almoravids were this fiercely orthodox, sort of puritanical Berber dynasty that had originated way down in the Sahara Desert. They'd built a powerful empire across North Africa.
And they came across to Spain.
They did. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid leader, led them across. They decisively defeated the Christian forces, particularly King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086. This temporarily halted the Christian advance.
Okay, so they saved the Taifas.
Well, yes and no. After helping them, Yusuf ibn Tashfin turned his attention to the Taifas themselves. He accused them of being too lax religiously and too decadent. One by one, he absorbed their kingdoms into his own empire.
So he unified Al-Andalus again, but under outside Berber rule.
Precisely. A clear shift from that mixed local rule, which was often Arab-led or had strong Arab elements, to a direct intervention and subsequent rule by a distinctly North African Berber power, starting around 1086.
And then you mentioned the Almohads replaced them.
Yes, history repeats itself, in a way. The Almoravids, in turn, became weakened by internal dissent and military defeats. They were eventually overthrown by the Almohads. This was another militant Berber alliance, this time originating from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco.
Another Berber group.
Yes, but distinct from the Almoravids with their own religious ideology. They consolidated power across North Africa and then gained control of Al-Andalus around 1147, establishing their Iberian capital in Seville.
What was their rule like?
It was characterized by a strong military zeal, a more centralized and arguably stricter interpretation of Islam, and unfortunately to some, a greater degree of intolerance towards non-Muslims, and even towards non-Orthodox Muslims compared to some earlier periods of Al-Andalus.
Okay. And what about the final Muslim kingdom in Iberia, the one that held out the longest?
That brings us to the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. It emerged around 1232 and lasted all the way to 1492.
Over 250 years. How did it survive?
Well, after the decisive Almohad defeat at the pivotal Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, Muslim rule in Iberia really collapsed, fractured into smaller pockets. The Emirate of Granada, nestled in its mountainous stronghold in the south, was the last independent Muslim state remaining. It became a cultural beacon, but in a shrinking territory.
And who ruled Granada? What was their ethnic makeup?
The ruling Nasrid dynasty actually had Arab origins. They claimed direct descent from a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, Sa'd ibn Ubadah, which provided significant religious and political legitimacy.
So they emphasized their Arab roots.
Very much so. They meticulously emphasized their Arab and Syrian heritage to legitimize their rule, even as their kingdom was often reduced to being a tributary vassal state, paying tribute to the powerful Christian crown of Castile to survive.
And this is the kingdom that built the Alhambra.
The very same. It famously produced that architectural masterpiece, the Alhambra Palace Complex, a truly breathtaking testament to Andalusi artistry and engineering, even in that final phase. Its fall in 1492, after a long siege by Ferdinand and Isabella, marked the definitive end of the Reconquista, ending nearly 8 centuries of Muslim political presence on the peninsula.
Wow. So this whole chronology, it makes it abundantly clear, doesn't it? Moorish rule wasn't one single thing.
Not at all.
It was this dynamic succession of different powers with distinct ethnic characteristics, Arabs, Berbers, locally converted Iberians, none of whom really align with that modern black racial category as the primary ruling group.
Exactly. The reality is far more complex and, frankly, more interesting than the simple label allows.
Okay, that chronological breakdown is invaluable for understanding the different layers here. Now, let's talk about how the people of Al-Andalus, the Moors themselves, using the term broadly, how do they represent their own identity, particularly in their art and literature? What can that tell us about how they saw themselves?
Well, it tells us a great deal, often by what they chose to emphasize and perhaps what they chose not to emphasize. Islamic art, for instance, especially in religious contexts like mosques, was largely aniconic.
Aniconic meaning, no figures.
Generally, yes. It avoided the depiction of living beings, particularly human or animal figures, largely to prevent any slide towards idolatry, which was a core religious prohibition.
So what did they focus on instead?
Decoration focused instead on incredibly intricate geometric patterns, what we often call arabesques, along with stylized floral motifs, and beautiful flowing calligraphy, often featuring verses from the Quran. You see this everywhere in Andalusi architecture, from the Great Mosque of Cordoba to the Alhambra. The walls themselves become texts and complex mathematical designs.
But not all Islamic art was strictly aniconic, was it? I seem to recall secular art, maybe in palaces or on objects, being a bit different.
You're absolutely right to make that distinction. Figurative art did thrive in secular courtly settings in Al-Andalus, particularly in private palaces and on luxury objects made for the elite.
Like what kind of things?
You can see beautiful examples in carved ivory caskets from the Cordoba period, often adorned with lively scenes of hunting, courtly life, musicians. Or think of the famous lion statues that guard the fountain in the Court of the Lions at the Alhambra.
Right, the lions.
These depictions sometimes showed rulers and court figures, yes, but they were typically stylized, almost emblematic, rather than realistic portraits in the modern sense. They weren't focused on capturing individual facial features or specific skin tones in a precise, detailed way that would allow for clear racial identification by today's standards.
So their purpose was more symbolic, representing power or an activity.
Largely, yes. Representing status or a scene, rather than aiming for a true physical likeness of a specific individual.
Okay, so if they weren't depicting themselves in realistic portraits that emphasized physical appearance, how did they define themselves in their literature? Was skin color important there, as it might be in some modern identity discussions?
That's a great question. In Arab Andalusi literature, poetry, history, biography, what was truly valued, meticulously preserved, and constantly emphasized was genealogy and lineage, known as nasab.
Nasab. So, like ancestry.
Exactly. Poets, historians, and scholars placed enormous emphasis on noble Arab ancestry. They would meticulously trace their family trees back to the earliest Arab tribes from Syria and Yemen, or connect themselves back to the Prophet Muhammad's companions. This was their primary mode of self-identification and claiming social status and validation.
And physical appearance, skin color.
Descriptions of physical appearance, including skin color, were remarkably rare in this context, and very much secondary to establishing one's prestigious tribal origin or demonstrating religious piety. This a profound focus on lineage, nasab, over outward phenotype in their self-identification. It stands in really stark contrast to the later Christian preoccupation with skin color that we'll get into.
Interesting.
For them, who your family was, where you came from, your tribal roots, that was far more significant in defining your identity than how you physically looked. It speaks to a very different cultural understanding of what identity meant. 15-second pause.
That's a really crucial point, the differing cultural priorities and how people define themselves. So if the people of Al-Andalus weren't primarily focused on skin color and their own self-representation, how did Christian Europeans portray them? Especially since the original claim we're investigating talks about whitewashing. Was there a consistent narrative from the Christian perspective? Did it match their actual observations, do you think?
Well, the Christian chronicles written in Iberia, particularly during the long centuries of the Reconquista, they were predominantly written from a hostile perspective, naturally.
As you'd expect in a conflict.
Right. And they frequently used highly racialized and, frankly, pejorative language when describing their Muslim adversaries. The term Moor itself was often used strategically, as we touched on, to conflate all Muslims with North Africans and Berbers. This effectively served to undermine any historical claim they might have to Iberian territory, casting them perpetually as foreign invaders. It was very much part of the political and religious struggle for control of the peninsula.
Okay. And what about that blackening you mentioned earlier? Was that a common motif? Was it like a deliberate rhetorical strategy?
It was indeed a powerful and pretty pervasive motif in certain kinds of texts. A recurring theme, especially in epic poetry and some chronicles, was the depiction of Muslim armies as monstrous, demonic, and explicitly black.
You gave an example earlier from the Historia de España.
Yes, that 13th century work commissioned by King Alfonso X of Castile, it provides really vivid examples. It described Moorish soldiers with their black faces like pitch, and the handsomest among them was as black as a cooking pot.
Wow.
And similar descriptions, using black as a pejorative and dehumanizing term, appear in other major European epics of the time, like the famous French epic, the Song of Roland, which portrayed the Saracen enemies as a folk as black as melted pitch, just utterly alien and dark.
So this blackening, it wasn't necessarily a factual observation of their predominant skin color.
Likely not, in many cases. It functioned more as a powerful polemical and theological tool. You have to remember the symbolism here.
Right.
In the medieval Christian imagination, the color black was strongly and symbolically linked to sin, to heresy, to evil, paganism, and most potently to the devil himself. So depicting the Muslim enemy as black as Satan was a way to dehumanize them, make them seem alien and monstrous. It framed the Reconquista not just as a fight for land, but as a holy war against literal forces of darkness and unholiness.
So it was more about religious and political propaganda than trying to give an accurate physical description. That's a very strong counterargument to the whole idea of whitewashing, isn't it?
It certainly complicates that narrative significantly, yes.
But what about visual art from Christian Iberia? Does that corroborate this literary blackening? Or does it maybe show something different, perhaps a more nuanced reality based on actual observation?
Here's where we see a really fascinating and stark contrast. It reveals the complexity of historical evidence beautifully. In complete opposition, really, to that literary motif of blackness used for polemical purposes, the visual art from Christian Spain often presents a much more complex and arguably more accurate picture.
Where do we see this most clearly?
The most significant evidence comes from the Cantigas de Santa Maria. This is that magnificent collection of over 400 narrative poems and songs, all praising the Virgin Mary, compiled in the 13th century under the patronage of King Alfonso X of Castile, the same king whose chronicle used that black as Pix language.
Interesting. So what do the pictures in the Cantigas show?
The hundreds of exquisite miniatures, the little paintings illustrating the songs, they depict all sorts of scenes involving Moors, in warfare, in court life, in daily interactions, even sometimes as supplicants praying before the Virgin Mary for miracles.
Okay. And their appearance.
Crucially, these Moors are illustrated with a wide range of skin tones. You see Moors depicted as very fair, sometimes almost indistinguishable in complexion from the Christian Iberians shown alongside them. You see others with distinctly brown skin tones, and yes, you also see some depicted with dark black skin.
So the artists were painting a whole spectrum of appearances. That sounds much more like an accurate representation of a diverse population rather than some deliberate alteration or a simple blackening like in the texts.
Precisely. These illustrations show, for example, fair-skinned Moorish kings and nobles receiving Christian envoys. They show brown-skinned Moorish soldiers in battle or working as artisans, and they show genuinely black African figures, often depicted as archers, musicians, or sometimes servants within Moorish contexts.
So the diversity was acknowledged visually.
Exactly. This visual diversity strongly indicates that Christian artists and their patrons were actually well aware that the Moor was not some homogeneous racial group. They understood it encompassed Arabs, Berbers, converted Iberians, and also sub-Saharan Africans. The art, therefore, seems to reflect a more nuanced, maybe more on-the-ground reality than the often simplistic and highly polemical literature. It suggests that while propaganda might paint one picture, lived experience and visual observation provided a more complex palette.
That's incredibly illuminating because it directly tackles that whitewashing claim head on. So how do we re-examine that specific claim in light of all this evidence, both the textual blackening and the varied visual depictions?
Well, the direct historical evidence, particularly the visual evidence, clearly contradicts the idea that Moors were systematically whitewashed in historical depictions. In fact, as we've seen, Christian polemical literature often engaged in the exact opposite strategy. A strategic blackening to demonize them. Right. The modern perception, the modern claim of whitewashing, likely stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the main ethnic identities of the people labeled Moors. As we've discussed at length now, the vast majority of the population and the overwhelming majority of the rulers of Al-Andalus were North African Berbers, Arabs, and native Iberians who had converted to Islam.
Groups who today we generally classify racially as white or brown, not typically black in the sub-Saharan African sense.
Exactly. These are groups who today would generally fall into those categories in contemporary racial classifications.
So if artists back then depicted them with lighter skin tones, it wasn't an act of altering their appearance to fit some later agenda, but was actually accurately representing the majority of them.
Precisely. Artistic depictions of Moors with lighter skin tones were not an act of whitewashing in the modern sense of erasing blackness. They were, in many cases, historically accurate representations of the majority of people identified by that term at that time. The very question of whitewashing inappropriately applies a modern, often American, binary racial framework, black and white, onto a medieval Iberian context.
Right.
Identity back then was defined much more by religion, by geography, by lineage, and by complex social hierarchies, rather than the simplistic skin color categories we sometimes try to impose retrospectively.
It's a complete apples and oranges comparison, isn't it? Trying to force a square peg into a round historical hole. Okay, let's talk about the final, often tragic act of this long history, the Reconquista reaching its end and its aftermath. What happened to the Muslim population of Spain after 1492?
Right. The Reconquista was, as we've noted, that centuries-long process where the Christian kingdoms of the north gradually expanded southward, culminating, of course, in the conquest of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada in 1492, a pivotal moment.
Did that victory lead to tolerance?
Sadly, no. It did not usher in an era of newfound tolerance. Instead, it intensified a policy of religious and increasingly ethnic homogenization across the now unified Spanish kingdoms under Ferdinand and Isabella. The Treaty of Granada, which was signed in 1491, just before the final surrender, it had initially guaranteed religious freedom and property rights for the defeated Muslims.
But those guarantees didn't last.
They were quickly and systematically violated, almost immediately,
Leading to
forced conversions and ultimately expulsions. A series of royal edicts, starting around 1500 in Castile and extending to Aragon by 1526, effectively outlawed Islam across all of Spain. Muslims were given a stark choice: convert to Christianity or leave. Those who converted, often under duress, were now disparagingly called Moriscos, literally meaning little Moors or Moor-like.
Moriscos. And were their conversions accepted?
Often not. Despite public conversion, many Moriscos secretly continued to practice Islam, a phenomenon known as crypto-Islam. They maintained their faith, their traditions, their language, often at incredible personal risk. This led to intense suspicion from the old Christians, who constantly questioned the sincerity of their conversions. And it made them targets for the Spanish Inquisition, which was specifically tasked with rooting out heresy, including suspected crypto-Islam or crypto-Judaism.
A climate of fear and persecution, then.
Absolutely. And this long, agonizing process spanning over a century culminated in the devastating expulsion of the Moriscos between 1609 and 1614 under King Philip III.
The final expulsion.
Yes. A massive act of ethnic cleansing. Hundreds of thousands of people, estimates usually hover around 300,000, were forcibly deported, mainly to North Africa. This effectively ended the large-scale, visible Muslim presence in Spain after nearly 800 years of history. A truly brutal end to that chapter. 15-second pause.
That's a truly tragic ending to such a long and incredibly rich history in Iberia. But despite this violent erasure at the end, the legacy of Al-Andalus, it clearly left an indelible imprint on Europe, didn't it? Its contributions still resonate even today.
Oh, absolutely. The contributions were immense. They were profound, transformative, shaping the very intellectual and cultural foundations of Europe in ways we perhaps don't always fully appreciate.
How so? Where do we see this impact most strongly?
Well, Al-Andalus served as a crucial conduit, a bridge, really, for transmitting classical Greek knowledge, much of which had been lost to the Latin West after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and also for transmitting advanced Islamic scholarship itself to Europe.
So preserving the old and adding the new.
Exactly. Works by ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle, mathematicians like Euclid, physicians like Galen. These texts, along with brilliant commentaries and original works by Islamic scholars, were translated from Arabic into Latin. This happened in bustling intellectual centers like Toledo, especially after its reconquest by Christians in 1085.
Toledo was key for translation, wasn't it?
Hugely important. This intellectual transfer directly fostered the rise of European scholasticism in the universities. It provided much of the intellectual fuel for the later Renaissance. Think about figures like Averroes Ibn Rushd, the brilliant Andalusi polymath whose commentaries on Aristotle were hugely influential, or Avicenna Ibn Sina, whose medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, was a standard text. These thinkers became cornerstones of European university curricula for centuries. Their ideas just permeated Western thought.
It wasn't just philosophy and ancient texts, though, right? I mean, practical sciences also saw huge advancements that must have shaped daily life.
Oh, without a doubt. In mathematics, for example, the scholars of Al-Andalus were instrumental in introducing the Hindu-Arabic numeral system to Europe.
Including zero.
Including the revolutionary concept of zero and the idea of place value. They brought algebra. The word itself comes from the Arabic al-jab, meaning the reunion of broken parts, from a famous book title, and algorithms named after the Persian polymath Al-Khwarizmi, whose work was translated and transmitted via Al-Andalus.
Just think about trying to do complex calculations with Roman numerals.
Exactly. Imagine trying long division with xxd and geeks and CLX7. The introduction of zero, a positional system, algebra, algorithms. It didn't just simplify math, it fundamentally unlocked the scientific revolution in Europe. It made advanced astronomy, engineering, international trade, banking, all of it possible in a way it hadn't been before.
And medicine, too.
Yes, Andalusi physicians were pioneers. Figures like Al-Zahrawi, known as Abul Qasis in the West, or Ibn Zur of Enzor. Al-Zahrawi wrote a massive 30-volume medical encyclopedia, Al-Tazrif, which detailed surgical instruments he invented and procedures like using catgut for internal sutures. It remained a standard surgical text in Europe for centuries. They established advanced hospitals, known as bimaristans, with practices that sound surprisingly modern, emphasis on hygiene, use of antiseptics, careful diagnosis, documented case studies, way ahead of their time in many respects.
And visually, I mean, you just have to look around southern Spain today. That Moorish style is still so distinctive. Its beauty is just unmistakable.
It truly is a breathtaking visual legacy. The architectural style developed in Al-Andalus left an indelible physical mark. You see it in masterpieces like the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which itself tells a story, originally a Visigothic church, then a magnificent mosque, then converted into a cathedral, reflecting those layers of history.
And the Alhambra, of course.
And of course, the Alhambra Palace in Granada, just sublime. Key features like the distinctive horseshoe arches, the intricate geometric tile work known as azulejos, the delicate carved stucco designs with their endless repeating patterns. These became ingrained in the Iberian architectural DNA.
Didn't this lead to a hybrid style, too?
Yes, it created the unique mudéjar style. This was a hybrid form of art and architecture built by Muslim artisans, mudéjars, who remained in Christian-controlled territories, working for Christian patrons. It created this beautiful fusion of Islamic and Christian artistic traditions and techniques, continuing long after the Reconquista technically ended in many areas.
And even our language you mentioned, it carries the echoes.
Indeed. Thousands of words in Spanish and Portuguese are of Arabic origin, a living testament to centuries of linguistic exchange and coexistence. You'll find them everywhere, especially, as you noted, those beginning with the Arabic definite article, al-muhada, algodon cotton, al-kalde mare, al-masen, warehouse, algebra, al-alchemia, alchemy.
Lots of everyday things.
Everyday things, scientific terms, administrative roles, agricultural products like aceituna, olive, or naranja, orange via Persian and Arabic. It's a linguistic bridge spanning centuries. And here's the profound irony in all of this.
Okay.
While Christian Spain, particularly in the 17th century, was actively expelling the Moriscos, the living inheritors and practitioners of so much of this Andalusi culture and knowledge, the intellectual and artistic foundations of Spain's own Golden Age, and indeed Europe's emerging Renaissance, were built substantially on the very knowledge that Al-Andalus had preserved, innovated upon, and transmitted. Spain simultaneously erased and absorbed its Islamic past. It's a complex, fascinating, and often tragic paradox that continues to resonate right down to the present day.
What a legacy, both brilliance and tragedy wrapped up together.
A testament, as you say, to the messy, complicated, but ultimately incredibly rich reality of history.
So after this incredible journey through history, linguistics, genetics, art, the whole suite, let's bring it all back to that initial claim that sparked our deep dive today.
Bro.
Black Moors ruled Europe and were later whitewashed. What's the definitive verdict based on all the evidence we've uncovered?
Well, the analysis, drawing on all those diverse strands of evidence, it leads to a pretty clear, though nuanced conclusion. And it decisively refutes that simplistic narrative.
Okay, let's break it down first. Were the Moors black in the modern racial sense as the ruling group?
No. The term Moor referred to a heterogeneous people. Primarily, as we've established, North African Berbers and Arabs formed the initial conquerors and ruling elites. And over time, the majority of the Muslim populace in Al-Andalus came to be of native Iberian origin who had converted to Islam.
And sub-Saharan Africans.
While sub-Saharan Africans were indeed present in Al-Andalus, sometimes visibly so, they were a distinct minority group. And crucially, they never constituted the ruling class. So the idea of Black Moors as the dominant or ruling group is fundamentally a historical oversimplification and an anachronism. It's applying a modern racial category inappropriately to the past.
Okay. Second part. Did they rule Europe?
Again, no. Their rule was strictly confined to the Iberian Peninsula, the territory known as Al-Andalus. It never extended across the entirety of the continent we call Europe. While their political actions, and perhaps more importantly, their intellectual and cultural influence on the rest of Europe were undeniably significant, hugely transformative in many ways, their actual physical dominion was geographically limited to that specific region of southwestern Europe.
Got it. And third, the claim of whitewashing in historical depictions. Were they whitewashed?
That also doesn't hold up to scrutiny based on the evidence. The assertion of systematic whitewashing is historically inaccurate. In fact, as we've meticulously shown, Christian polemical literature often engaged in the opposite, a strategic blackening to demonize their Muslim enemies for theological and political reasons.
But the art showed something different.
Exactly. The visual art from the period, like the Cantigas de Santa Maria, shows a clear recognition of their ethnic diversity. It depicts people identified as Moors with a wide range of skin tones, fair, brown, and black, which accurately reflected the actual diverse populace of Al-Andalus, composed of Arab, Berber, Iberian, and some sub-Saharan African elements. So, depicting lighter skin tones wasn't erasure. It was often accurate representation of the majority.
So the complex truth, as it so often is far more interesting and far more revealing than the simplified claim we started with.
Absolutely. The story of the Moors in Iberia is not some simple black and white narrative. Not good versus evil, not easily reducible to modern racial categories. It's an incredibly complex history spanning nearly 800 years. It's the story of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society that was a vibrant crucible, a place of profound conflict, yes, but also of remarkable coexistence and cultural fusion.
And its legacy.
Its enduring legacy is not that of some lost black kingdom, as a narrative sometimes implies. It's the legacy of a foundational civilization with immense tangible contributions to science, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, art, architecture, language, elements that profoundly shape the course of European history and continue to resonate in the culture of modern Spain and Portugal, and indeed the world.
That's such a rich tapestry, and hearing all this really makes you think, doesn't it? How often do we simplify these incredibly complex historical narratives? We squash them into convenient modern binaries or easily digestible soundbites.
We do it all the time.
And what profound richness, what crucial truth do we actually lose in that process by imposing our present-day frameworks, our current concerns, onto the past?
It's a question worth pondering deeply, I think, because it speaks volumes about how we understand not just history, but perhaps ourselves in our own time as well.
And that, my friends, brings us to the end of another deep dive. Today, we truly saw the power of detailed historical analysis cross-referencing all those diverse sources to reveal the true complexity behind what often seem like simple black and white claims.
We really hope this encourages you, the listener, to continue your own deep dives, to question common assumptions, maybe dig a little deeper than the headline or the social media post, and always seek out those nuanced, multifaceted historical accounts.
Because understanding these intricate historical layers, wrestling with the complexity, it offers a far richer, more satisfying, and ultimately more valuable perspective than any quick soundbite could ever provide. Thank you so much for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll be back soon with more fascinating insights.
This story isn't over. Subscribe to carry it forward.